Sawubona. This is the African-centered biological nationalist program. I'm your host, Bekazitha, and the aim of this public affairs program is to discuss issues confronting Africans across the globe, especially in the United States, with a concentrated focus on clarifying who is Black/African and how Africans must utilize this definition to attain power. This program will discuss how light-skinned people, multi-generational people, are not Black or African. So let's get started. I will be using Evolution by Douglas J. Futuyama as a reference book for my definitions. Number one reason, the light skin pigmentation was introduced into East Africa by gene flow from non-Africans. We know this is a fact because it is highlighted in this research paper labeled loci associated with skin pigmentation identified in African populations. In the abstract, I have highlighted the finding, which states genetic evidence indicates that the light pigmentation variant at SLC24A5 was introduced into East Africa by gene flow from non-Africans. And here is a diagram or a map of Europe, a portion of Africa. This is Spain, Portugal, and this is the Middle East or Western Asia. Origin of blue eyes, OCA2, that is a gene or allele, approximately 42,000 years ago, and light skin, SLC24A5 plus SLC45A2, approximately 42,000 years ago. Thus, light skin is not an African trait. So that is reason number one. Gene flow is the exchange of genes between two populations. This is an important definition to understand. Population is a group of conspecific organisms that occupy a more or less well-defined geographic region and exhibit reproductive continuity from generation to generation. Ecological and reproductive interactions are more frequent among these individuals than with members of other populations of the same species. Remember, Africans are a unique race because Africans on the continent of Africa were the first and only anatomically correct humans on the planet for 250,000 years. Hence, Africans developed a unique genome. It is only relatively recent, about 50,000 years ago, that Asians and Europeans emerged from a series of evolutionary processes, mainly natural selection via sexual selection. Recall, a genome is the complete set of genetic information in an organism. It provides all of the information the organism requires to function. In living organisms, the genome is stored in long molecules of DNA called chromosomes. Chromosomes are structures within cells that contain a person's genes. Genes are segments of DNA. A chromosome is a condensed form of DNA. Genes are transcribed and translated by the cell to make proteins. Proteins create a visible phenotype. Example of a gene. The OCA2 gene causes oculocutaneous albinism type 2, which is a common type of albinism, especially in Africans. It is characterized by loss of pigment containing melanocytes in the skin. Phenotype, the morphological, physiological, biochemical, behavioral, and other properties of an organism manifested throughout its life, or any subset of such properties, especially those affected by a particular allele or other portion of the genotype. Africans. Meiosis is a process that contributes to genetic variety. Gene frequency details how often a particular allele appears in a population. And since Africans are the first anatomically correct humans to inhabit the earth for about 250,000 years, before Asians, who evolved about 50,000 years ago, and Europeans, who evolved about 30,000 years ago, it should be logically understood that Africans developed a unique genome, thus a unique gene frequency, that is, alleles, only seen in the African race, which again was separated by mountains, land, and sea, thus isolating Africans for tens of thousands of millenniums. One thing African people tend to be unaware of, because of a flood of false European socialization due to the enslavement of Africans and the social practice of Europeans defining all non-whites, blacks / African, is how variation works when it comes to humans and specifically Africans. And why to be labeled Black, African, proper, one must have brown to black skin and African textured hair. However, Africans do vary in phenotypical traits. Let's explore the process which enables this variation within limits, thus a threshold. Meiosis. The process is called meiosis. What is meiosis? It is a process that contributes to genetic variety. First, chromosomes are made of DNA and protein. Human cells have 46 chromosomes. Meiosis makes sperm and egg cells. There are 23 chromosomes in sperm and egg cells, respectively. The first stage of meiosis. And meiosis can be divided into 9 stages. These are divided between the first time the cells divides, meiosis 1, and the second time it divides, meiosis 2. For clarification, only one pair of chromosomes is being shown to illustrate meiosis. There usually would be 22 other chromosomes in a human cell. Recall, a chromosome is a condensed form of DNA. Interphase 1, the DNA in the cell is copied, resulting in two identical full set of chromosomes. Prophase 1, the copied chromosomes condense into X-shaped structures that can be easily seen under a microscope, and genes are exchanged. This is a very important portion of the process. Recombination occurs. Metaphase 1, chromosomes line up at equator. So this is how recombination occurs. It creates new combinations of genes in the gametes, sperm cells, egg cells, that's another word for it, that are not found in either parents, which can contribute to increased diversity. This is the act of crossing over. The end result is two recombinant chromosomes, which have a different combination of genes than either parent. This causes variety. Anaphase 1, chromosomes pulled apart. Telophase 1 and cytokinesis, cell pinches in the middle. Prophase 2, two daughter cells, each with 23 chromosomes, 23 pairs of chromatids. Even though in the image it only shows one, imagine there are 22 more chromosomes in the daughter cells. Metaphase 2, in each of the two daughter cells, the chromosomes, pair of sister chromatids, line up end to end along the equator of the cell. Anaphase 2, the sister chromatids are then pulled to opposite poles due to the action of the meiotic spindle. Telophase 2, cells pinch in the middle. And finally, cytokinesis. The chromosomes complete their move to the opposite poles of the cell. At each pole of the cell, a full set of chromosomes gather together. A membrane forms around each set of chromosomes to create two new cell nuclei. This is the last phase of meiosis. Male sperms are created. These four cells are all sperm cells. In females, one of the cells is an egg cell, while the other three are polar bodies. That is, small cells that do not develop into eggs. So once again, just to recap, there are 23 chromosomes in sperm and egg cells respectively. The sperm cell fuses with the egg cell and releases its chromosomes. The sperm chromosomes join with those of the egg cell to form a full normal set of 46 chromosomes. This is an example of a chromosome. Paternal chromosome and maternal chromosome. These are a genetic locus is the location of a particular gene on a chromosome. This is the example here. At each genetic locus, an individual has two alleles, one on each homologous chromosome. This is the paternal and this is the maternal. Homozygous dominant, which is AA. Homozygous recessive, BB. Heterozygous, C, lowercase c, capital C. 3 gene pairs at 3 different loci. It's said to many geneticists believe that there are over 50,000 genes, and many geneticists don't know how they actually reveal themselves. So once again, the light skin pigmentation was introduced into East Africa by gene flow from non-Africans. And this is the evidence. So that means light skin is not an African trait. Since light skin is an allele found in non-African populations, multiracials who identify as Black or African in contemporary populations that have Africans within it are products of recent admixture events, since this allele would have been weeded out due to its non-existence in the African population. Imagine it is 1860. You are an African female who arrived on the shores of Georgia 17 years ago and was sold to a white plantation owner who bought you to be his maid. His wife is your taskmaster, and she overworks you. Your plantation owner, on the other hand, who is a member of the church and preaches its virtues, treats you rather well. He gives you linen so that you can make your own clothes, allows you to grow your own food in a private garden, and respects your Sundays off. One day, while your female taskmaster is away, your owner appears in front of you naked. He waves you toward his bedroom as he walks towards it. In your mind, you have a choice. You can act as if you do not understand, or you can give in to his desire and have sex with him. You choose to do the latter. 9 months later, you have a healthy baby girl. The vast majority of enslaved people on your plantation look at you with contempt. But there are others who see your birth as a validation of their humanity, for they have been taught by the plantocracy for 240 years that they are not real humans. Were you raped, coerced, duped? Does it matter when defining the race of the child? Now, some Black people will say that the recent products of interracial relationships, for example, biracial children, were produced via rape during the first 2 centuries of slavery in North America and South America. It doesn't add up. So there had to be a great level of racial treason between authentic Blacks, people between the color spectrum of brown to Black and who had African textured hair, for there to have developed large pockets of multiracial societies in early America. Multiracial people who detested the whole idea of being associated with being descendants of Africans. Multiracial people who formed their own churches, political organizations, neighborhoods, and schools. According to Obaya Gelly, so any survival of this allele would indicate disloyalty to the African race. No matter what the circumstance, i.e. rape, a multiracial person is multiracial. They cannot be African. Number 3, Multiracials formed their own communities in the United States, Brazil, and on the continent of Africa. This is important to emphasize. And on the continent of Africa, Igbos, the San people, people in Northeast Africa, in Kenya, in Mozambique, Angola. According to Obayageli Lake in Mulattoes and Color Consciousness in the United States, since the 16th century, miscegenation between people of African and European descent has created a population of mixed-race people in all parts of the African diaspora. In the United States, this population was produced in three ways: the European rape of African women, legal marriages, and consensual sexual relations outside of marriage. The European rape of African women, which began on slave ships and continued on the plantations, resulted in a lighter-skinned mulatto class that served as a buffer between African and European Americans. Because of this estrangement from the African American community, this mixed race group caused a significant rift in cultural and political solidarity in North America. We see this till this day, as well as in other parts of the African diaspora. During America's slave era, mulattoes were often given freedom, which afforded them economic and educational opportunities over authentic Africans. This was especially so in Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana, where prosperous mulattoes sustained endogamous social and political communities. Attention to these disparities within the American pigmentocracy/caste system are important to better understand the way in which class was intricately tied to color. Moreover, the legacy of mulatto economic advantage was passed down to successive generations along the future generational cultural mannerisms and ideological beliefs. Where the evidence or literature addresses divisions between mulattoes and Africans, some scholars suggest that at the turn of the 20th century, these differences have disappeared. This claim requires further investigation and is taken up here in this discussion. While miscegenation between European Americans, American women, and African men was rare. Let me repeat that. While miscegenation between European American women and African men was rare, the majority of mixed partners consisted of European men and African women. Many of these men were upper class who took advantage of slave women or who courted mulatto women. In some parts of the South, even with anti-miscegenation laws in place, mulatto women had open consensual affairs with European American men. Women among the gens de couleur, the French phrase for people of color, of New Orleans, Louisiana, are most notable in this regard. In many cases, female slaves were forced into the fancy trade, a process by which female slaves called fancy maids were sold at auction into prostitution and concubinage by their masters. But open consensual relations were the order of the day. Not only did European men find these women exceptionally attractive, but the women fashioned themselves as superior to darker-skinned people of African descent. The practice of miscegenation in Louisiana was so common that it developed into an institution known as flacage, a left-handed marriage or concubinage with benefits. In New Orleans, interracial affairs were institutionalized in quad room balls. These were regular and public affairs in which wealthy European American men formally courted prospective mulatto mistresses. Some of these common law marriages were short-lived. Others lasted until the death of one of the partners. The commonality of these unions is indicated in the following article in the Washington Bee. White Men in Louisiana Marrying Colored Women is the title. She's my wife. We have lived together 38 years. The law cannot estrange us, the white man says. Thus spoke Joseph Lawrence, a white farmer in the Second Criminal Court, while he was awaiting trial on the charge of marrying a colored woman. Through the arrest of Lawrence and his colored wife, the police discovered a hard situation. All around Lee's Station, the white farmers and fishermen and other classes have intermarried with colored people and reared large families, regardless of the law against such. A number of arrests have been made, but it has been impossible to convict one for the reason that the white parties all went on the stand and swore they were colored. Just what the prosecuting attorney can do remains to be seen. This was in October. This was in the Washington Bee, October 23rd, 1909. Mixed race marriages had long been prohibited in New Orleans, but it occurred frequently enough that another bill was introduced into the legislature in February 1857 to outlaw marriages between people of European descent and anyone with a taint of African blood. So we see the start of the one-drop rule being enforced. Mulattoes often viewed themselves as more physically attractive based on their lighter skin, straighter hair, and sometimes European facial features. In some cases, European Americans felt that mulattoes were more mentally fit than other people of African descent, and considered light-skinned men to be better leaders of African Americans' social and political pursuits. I wonder why. Mulattoes fancied themselves as superior to other people of African descent and fashioned themselves as leaders of the race. A number of European Americans thought that mixed bloods were more intelligent than other people of African descent, but they did not think them equal in any sense. The people of European extraction, even though light-skinned people enjoyed social and economic advantages, European Americans defined racial categories in black and white terms and discriminated against light and dark, giving preference to lighter-skinned people when it was to European American advantage. Nevertheless, mulattoes strove to emulate European Americans in appearance and social and political manners. The goal of many in this category was to create a third caste system that would repudiate the bipolar racial categories that defined racial demography in the United States. In antebellum North America and during Reconstruction, several mulattoes formed exclusive social organizations, while sometimes charitable to poorer Africans, were adamant in their commitment to the maintenance of the color line within the American system. In the 19th and 20th centuries, people of mixed descent continued to form exclusive groups. While many of these organizations did not include a color requirement as part of their written charter, it was implicit that membership in these groups was open only to people of lighter skin. Such individuals continued to curry favor with the European American community as well. Blue Veiners. The Blue Vein Society, organized in Nashville, Tennessee, was an organization primarily based on skin color. The rules for inclusion left nothing to the imagination because the application had to be fair enough, or I should say the applicant had to be fair enough for the spidery network of purplish veins at the risk to be visible to a panel of expert judges. Access to certain vacation resorts was even said to be restricted to blue veiners. Colorblind legal environment. As debates and tensions persisted within the African American community, European American racism continued at ideological and legal levels. Resistance to this state of affairs was consistent throughout slavery in America and continued after its demise. One of the signature cases that characterized the postbellum era was Homer Adolph Plessy versus the state of Louisiana, popularly known as Plessy versus Ferguson. This case is relevant not only because it characterizes the racial climate of the day, but for its instructiveness on the racism and bigotry of multi-generational, multiracial people. On June the 7th, 1892, Homer Plessy, a shoemaker from New Orleans, was incarcerated for sitting in a white-only railroad car of the East Louisiana Railroad. Plessy took the case to court and argued that the Separate Car Act violated his 13th and 14th Amendment rights. John Howard Ferguson, a lawyer from Massachusetts who adjudicated the case, decided that the state had a right to uphold the Separate Car Act on interstate travel. Plessy appealed to the state Supreme Court, where Justice Henry Brown upheld Ferguson's decision. The language in his decision clearly demonstrates the power of white people to reinterpret the law in ways that work to the majority's advantage. Brown declared that the Separate Car Act does not conflict with the 13th Amendment, since it had no tendency to destroy the legal equalities of the two races. The only dissenter in the case was Justice John Harlan, who emphasized that the Constitution was intended to be colorblind and that in respect to civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. For decades to come, Harlan's words fell on deaf ears. In the South and other parts of the country, and African Americans had yet to enjoy the freedoms promised by the Reconstruction Amendments. Moreover, Plessy versus Ferguson effectively redoubled the effects of the 1883 constitutional amendment that overturned the 1875 Civil Rights Act that declared public accommodations equally available to all citizens. With their ability to change state and constitutional laws at their discretion, European Americans extended their dominance and white power. What is even more interesting about Plessy's case is that Homer Plessy was not outraged because the rights of African Americans were once again abolished. Instead, his concern was that he was not regarded as a European American. He was an octoroon, according to him, 7/8 European and 1/8 African descent. He argued that property was considered part of citizenship and that his European genealogy was property. Even though Plessy had been living as a European American and looked visibly white, the court considered him to be a person of African descent. So this is another example of the one-drop rule being enforced, a social rule, because I already went over the genetics. Reason number 4, because of affirmative action and state sanctioned benefits, multiracials have started to claim to be Black and African. Let me repeat that. Because of affirmative action and state sanctioned benefits, multiracials have started to claim to be Black and African. We see this in Brazil. Of course, we see this in the United States. They have done this for purely financial reasons, but their genome is not African. Multiracials, number 5. The 5th reasons, multiracials do not have African textured hair. So we already went over meiosis is a process that contributes to genetic variety. We can see, obviously, the differences between multiracial people or multiracial female versus a Black female. We can see that this multiracial is outside the color spectrum and lacks African textured hair. These are the 2 traits that you must have to be an African. Now, some black men are still following the old routine, even in Africa, and they wonder, they try to include these people as a group. It's amazing. It's amazing. All right, so let me once again say this is the African-Centered Biological Nationalist Program. I'm your host, Beck Zitha. And the aim of this program is to discuss issues confronting Africans across the globe, especially in the United States, with a concentrated focus on clarifying who is Black/African and how Africans must utilize this definition to attain power. All right, so if there's any questions in regards to my presentation, please tell me right now. Once again, the African-centered biological nationalist theory is that brown to Black skin, African textured hair, they are responsible for African people's physiques, which are more muscular. African people have a higher ratio of fast twitch muscles than whites and multiracials. Africans are faster and leap farther due to superior fast twitch muscles. Africans have more energy producing enzymes in their muscles. Africans process oxygen more efficiently, which translates into greater aerobic endurance. And the African-centered biological nationalist theory is that the genes responsible for hair texture and skin color, they have quantitative inheritance qualities, which are the determination of a particular characteristic, such as fast twitch muscles. I should say determination of a particular characteristic, hair texture, height, or skin color by many genes. And these many genes regarding the gene that's responsible for brown to Black skin, producing that protein that affects the production of melanin, and the gene responsible for African textured hair, there's some type of connection between those 2 genes and the amazing athletic ability of Africans when they stay in shape. I'm not talking about obese people. I'm not talking about obese people that are obese because they are depressed. And they're being told that they have to assimilate, and they're being told all these lies that are not factual. The one-drop rule is a fallacy and pseudoscience. And anyone that wants to argue, tell me differently, please, you can You can leave a comment, or I may even put you on the program. All right, so let me see. What else do I need to say here? Let me see. Let me look at some of the questions. Does anybody have a question here? All right. All right. Let me see if I will add somebody to the chat. I think, let me see. Let me check. But one more thing. Let me just add this. What is genetic diversity in Africans? Now, this is a discussion that people have a lot. They don't understand. Every paper that I've read has nothing to do with skin color. And if it does, it's including North Africa. So they have a broad definition of who is African. But the papers that I've read about genetic diversity, because I know you guys haven't, many of you haven't, because you keep on repeating Africans are diverse. Africans are, has a great amount of diversity. Well, what are they talking about? They're talking about disease susceptibility, malaria resistance in Africa. They're talking about dietary adaptation in African populations. They're talking about long limbs, short limbs, large trunks, small trunks, normal noses, narrow noses, round heads, prognathism. Let's give an example. Remember, gene frequency helps to understand genetic diversity in a population. Given the fact that Africans had developed their own gene frequency for over 250,000 years before the first Asian and whites evolved from Africans via many mutations, some of these genes within the Asian and European genome being very deleterious, one should easily understand that the term genetic diversity is associated with the idea that Africans have developed genes which increase their survival on the earth. Populations, once again, is another word for race that have developed unique traits due to isolation caused by mountains, oceans, and relative long distance. Another way to look at this philosophically is Occam's razor. Occam's razor is the principle that if two explanations that account for all the facts, the simpler one is more likely to be correct. What's Occam's razor in this case? The majority up until this point, the majority of people on the continent of Africa have African textured hair and brown to black skin. So using reason, logic, that means that those are the traits of African people, full stop. Let's look at diversity. Let's look at diversity in the African population. The Mbuti pygmies. Someone brought this up the other week. He didn't have a good grasp of why certain people that's the diversity that we're talking about. Examples of African genetic diversity due to environment and nutrition. The Mbuti pygmies they evolved, or I should say they traveled to Central Africa, I should say. Researchers have traditionally defined pygmies as hunter-gatherer populations with an average adult male height of no more than 155 centimeters or about 5 feet 1 inch. Here's some pictures of them. Researchers have found slowed growth during childhood for Africa's Mbuti pygmies, apparently due to reduced levels of a key growth hormone. Such data suggests that these groups have evolved small bodies in direct response to as yet undefined long-term challenges in distinctive habitat, I should say. Pygmy body size vary considerably over time, that they correlate strongly with mortality rates, and that increasing mortality rates led to even greater reduction of body size. They were going through famine in many of these areas. That's why many populations of Africans, they remained in a banned political organization called a band. A band is the smallest unit of political organization, consisting of only a few families and no formal leadership positions. So many of these African populations were bands. And this is why we have so many languages, but many of them are very similar. Look at Xhosa and Zulu, very similar vocabulary, cliques, very similar. And you can find this in the Congo region as well. West Africa and Southwest Africa as well. Many languages are very similar because people were escaping famine. People were dealing with challenging situations. We think of Africa, of course, as rich with fruit and so on and so forth, but there were, of course, natural disasters in those areas, and people weren't prepared to deal with them. But so many of these political organizations, this is a anthropological term, a social anthropological term, which says, once again, a band is the smallest unit of political organization consisting of only a few families and no formal leadership position. So they weren't even tribes. They weren't even tribes. Findings support a scenario in which most females reproduce at relatively young ages, probably in the response to high mortality rates. This physical trait then become more common from one generation to the next. Early maturing bodies divert physiological resources away from growth, yielding small bodies as a side effect, the researchers hypothesize. All right, so that's 5 reasons light-skinned people aren't African or Black. Now, I have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask the audience. Let me get back over here real quick. And people could leave it in the comment section. I'm a serious person. I'm serious about this. So I want to frame this conversation with this in mind. What I find interesting about Africans pushing ethnicity over race, and that goes for people who subscribe to the African-American versions of this point of view, i.e. ADOS, a joke. What I find interesting is how some are not aware that their ancestors were absorbed by other African tribes and how they immigrated from other areas of Africa, and how they are buying hook, line, and sinker the trope that African Americans do not know where they are from, and thus this loss of culture causes the dysfunctional behavior we see in the African American community. However, African countries are dysfunctional as well. So what does that say about African culture and ethnicities? Nonetheless, here is a broader question. Where do you see an African superpower? I'm not speaking about a nation such as Nigeria, where the whites are the owners of the means of production, where some Africans are propped up as major wholesalers of raw goods. Quite the opposite. I want to know, where are the African nations that have an economy which allows there to be a tax base to build roads, schools, and hospitals, which are available to the entire public, not the wealthy of the country, which mostly is made up of whites who work in multinational companies? Where is the African nation with an army, navy, air force, Marines that can protect its borders and skies? Where is there an African nation that has produced its own nuclear bomb? There is none. There is none. The reason for this is the culture. I believe, as Amos Wilson did, the greatest African philosopher of all time, that we must have an African-centered culture, a social container that helps Africans / Black to illuminate our past as a reminder and a beacon of camaraderie for a culture. A culture's major purpose is to join individuals together to frame their behavior so that it is productive and enriches not the individual themselves, but the entire race. This is why he recommended that African Americans pick a African ethnicity carefully if they were gonna adopt one. I on the other hand, have found that one of the flaws with Amos Wilson's rhetoric is that he did not emphasize enough on phenotypical cohesion, although he mentioned it occasionally, but he was not explicit. At bottom, we have to want to give our offspring a better world, a world where they can be self-actualizing individuals, a world that focuses on fulfilling our purpose, that is securing the racial integrity of the group. What better thing to live for individually and collectively? When this is done, we can start speaking collectively as soon as we define properly who's an African language, such as Zulu, and practicing traditional family collectivist habits. So that has to be the aim. That has to be the aim. All right, so let me see. I will just show quickly these people that want to talk about. Oh, I took a DNA test. I say this in every video, but I'm going to point this out. Organized thoughts, not emotional thoughts. Organized thoughts, not emotional thoughts. I know some of you want to go off the hinge, or you want to talk off, just everything that comes to your mind. It doesn't make any sense. Unfortunately, it doesn't make any sense. All right, Sheldon Krimsky is a physicist. I don't know if many of you are college grads. It doesn't really matter, but to become a physicist, it's a rigorous field of study. So he doesn't have to be a geneticist to understand the operations, because physicists they have to think in abstract ways. And he stated in this report, well, he cited someone by the name of Duster that said the public needs to understand that those reference populations, they're talking about ancestry informative markers, comprise relatively small groups of contemporary people. These are for-profit companies that are feeding into your self-loathing, your amnesia, your delusions, and they're selling you a product. They're using contemporary populations as the benchmarks. Those group samples may have migrated over several centuries, and thus those researchers must make many untested assumptions in using these contemporary groups to stand as proxies for populations from centuries ago, whether putatively representing a continent, a region, or a linguistic, ethnic, or tribal group. Given these intractable barriers to even low-level probabilistic reliability, Africa was a bowl or something of the sort. Actually, I looked at the climate classification of Africa. It does have a cold desert in the southern portion of Africa, but the majority of southern Africa is not a cold climate. Relatively speaking, the entire continent is very warm. So that does not, there's no evolutionary process in which one can say, well, the light-skinned people there are light because it's cold, or there's not less sun going. I mean, it's right near the equator. It's not like there's less sun hitting the southern portion of Africa. So that doesn't make any sense at all either. So, all right. So let me see if anyone has anything to say.